Claire stood near the entrance of the plane watching passengers, bored with the usual tiredness of someone who had seen it all. The excitement of travel had long worn off for her. The young flight attendant glanced around the busy terminal, trying to shake off the stress of the upcoming flight. It was a routine she had grown used to, but there was always something about the long-haul flights that felt different. The energy in the air was heavier, the passengers often more demanding or difficult, and she was always left to manage it all with a smile, no matter how tired or frustrated she felt. As the passengers shuffled onto the plane, Claire found herself checking the boarding list with a sense of impatience. The flight was nearly full, and she was already mentally preparing for what would surely be an exhausting few hours. But then her eyes caught the name on the ticket, Miss Thompson. He was listed as one of the final passengers to board. Claire sighed, thinking about how she'd have to deal with an elderly man who was most likely going to need extra help navigating the cabin. She didn't mind assisting people, but something about elderly passengers always made her feel a bit uneasy. Maybe it was their slow movements. Maybe it was the fact that she always had to repeat herself when explaining safety instructions. But whatever the reason, she had learned to dread the ones that looked like they'd be a hassle. As the doors opened and the final few passengers began to board, Claire noticed him. Miss Thompson was exactly what she had expected, an older man wearing a worn-out suit and leaning heavily on a cane. As he slowly made his way toward the front of the plane, his movements were slow, deliberate, but there was a quiet dignity about him that immediately struck Claire. For a moment, she almost felt guilty for her initial assumptions, but she quickly brushed it off. He was just another elderly passenger who would need more attention than she cared to give. She watched him, carefully taking one labored step after another, before finally arriving at his seat in first class. He seemed to struggle with his luggage a bit, and Claire felt her frustration rising already. She approached him with the practiced politeness she had learned over the years. "Can I help you with your bag, sir?" she asked, trying to sound cheerful, but her voice came out sharper than she intended. The old man looked up at her. His eyes were clear but kind, and he smiled a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thank you, young lady, I can manage," he said, his voice soft and steady. Claire didn't have time to dwell on his words. Instead, she moved to help another passenger, but something about the way he looked at her lingered in her mind. As the last few passengers settled in, Claire moved down the aisle, once again her eyes passing over Miss Thompson. He sat quietly looking out the window, his face expressionless. His hands rested on the armrests, gently yet firmly, like he had all the time in the world. Despite being clearly frail, there was something undeniably strong about him, something that set him apart from the usual passengers she had helped today. The plane began to taxi, and Claire moved to her usual position near the front of the cabin, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Miss Thompson. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to him than what met the eye, and yet she couldn't place why she felt that way. Maybe it was just her imagination playing tricks, or maybe it was the sudden heaviness of the air that made her uneasy, the weight of the unknown hanging in the cabin. But then something else happened. Claire caught a glimpse of his hands. He was holding a small leather-bound notebook with a pen in his lap. His fingers moved slowly, as if writing something down, his movements deliberate and measured. But there was a depth to it, something that told her this wasn't just any casual journaling. The look on his face was different, almost like he was lost in the words, as if the notebook held memories that were too important to forget. Her curiosity started to gnaw at her, and before she knew it, she was staring at him, watching him write. In the quiet hum of the cabin, the sound of his pen against the paper was the only thing Claire could hear. Her focus entirely on him. It was strange, she thought. Why would an elderly man carry a notebook so diligently on a flight? Surely it wasn't just a passing interest. He had something to write, something to say. But what could it be? What could he possibly have to write down that was so important? She found herself wondering if this was just another one of those strange quirks that some older passengers had, or if it was something deeper. maybe even something she hadn't experienced before. As the plane continued its journey into the sky, Claire moved down the aisle again, checking in with passengers and offering a polite smile here and there, but her mind kept drifting back to Mr. Thompson. She couldn't help it. There was something about him that nagged at her, something that made her want to know more. She found herself glancing over at his seat every few minutes, but he was still focused on his notebook, still writing, as if nothing in the world could distract him. And for a brief moment, Claire felt an odd sense of envy for his quiet concentration. It was a peace she rarely found herself able to achieve with the constant noise and demands of her job. She shook her head, clearing the thoughts from her mind. It wasn't her business what he wrote in his notebook. After all, it was probably nothing more than a few random thoughts or reflections on life, things that old men often did to pass the time. But something about the way he held the pen with such care and precision made her wonder if there was more to it than that. Maybe he wasn't as fragile as he appeared. Maybe there was something stronger behind those tired eyes. It wasn't long before Claire found herself passing by his seat again. This time her curiosity was impossible to ignore. She forced herself to approach him with a professional smile. "How are you doing, sir? Can I get you anything?" she asked, hoping her voice wouldn't betray the sudden wave of curiosity that was bubbling up inside her. Miss Thompson looked up slowly, his eyes meeting hers once again. There was that same quiet smile, but this time there was something different in the way he looked at her, a glimmer of recognition, or understanding perhaps. It was as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. "I'm doing fine, thank you," he said softly, his voice still steady and calm. "But if you're interested, I can tell you a story." He added, his tone so casual that Claire didn't even know how to respond. For a moment she blinked in surprise. "A story?" she echoed, almost laughing at the oddness of it. He just nodded, and for a brief second Claire found herself genuinely intrigued against her better judgment. She took a seat beside him, her eyes flicking down to his notebook. But she didn't ask about it yet, not wanting to seem too obvious. "Go ahead," she said, trying to sound disinterested, even though her mind was racing. "What's the story?" Miss Thompson shifted in his seat and settled his cane beside him. Before speaking, his voice grew quieter, as if he was carefully choosing his words. "It's not a story I tell often," he began, his gaze drifting out the window, "but it's one I've carried with me for a long time." Claire felt a shiver run down her spine. His words weren't what she expected. They weren't casual or light-hearted. They were heavy, with something deeper, something that demanded her attention. He continued in a low voice. "It was during the war time, when life and death were never far apart. We were deep in enemy territory, and the world felt like it was closing in on us. Every day was a fight for survival. I remember one particular night like it was yesterday. We were hiding in a small village, not far from the border, when we heard the sounds of footsteps coming closer, the kind of footsteps that made your heart stop. We knew we had to move, or we'd be trapped." Claire felt a cold chill pass through her as she listened, his voice steady, but filled with the weight of memory, as if he had lived through it all again. For a brief moment, Claire thought about interrupting him to ask if he was all right, if this story was too much for him. But something held her back. Maybe it was the quiet strength in his voice, or maybe it was the way his eyes seemed to reflect the very war he was describing. Either way, she felt compelled to keep listening to what was unfolding before her as he spoke of narrow escapes and close calls. His words painted a vivid picture of danger and loss. Claire found herself hooked in a way she hadn't expected, her earlier judgments about him slipping away. He paused for a moment, and Claire wondered if he was done, but when he spoke again, his voice was even quieter, almost as if he was speaking to himself. "We had to make a choice that night, a choice that haunted me for years, the kind of choice no one should ever have to make." Claire felt a knot form in her stomach, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. But she couldn't bring herself to ask more questions, not yet. She was afraid of what he might say next, afraid of what would happen if she learned more about this man who had seen things she couldn't even imagine. The plane hummed steadily through the sky, and for a moment all Claire could hear was the sound of Miss Thompson's voice and the faint rustling of the air conditioning above their heads. It was as if everything around them had disappeared, leaving only the story unfolding. Between them, Miss Thompson's eyes were far away, now lost in the past. As if the present didn't matter at all, Claire leaned in a little closer, her curiosity getting the better of her. She hadn't expected this kind of conversation from a man she had pegged as just another frail old traveller, but now she was beginning to understand that there was something much deeper to him than his weathered appearance. He was still staring out the window, as if the scene outside could remind him of the things he'd seen long ago. His voice dropped even lower when he spoke again. We had to decide who would stay behind and hold off the enemy while the rest of us escaped, he said with such gravity that it sent a chill down Claire's spine. The decision was harder than any of us imagined. The man who volunteered had a family waiting for him back home, and the rest of us knew that if we left him he wouldn't survive. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she listened, the weight of his words sinking in. But there was more to come, more that would change everything she thought she knew about the man sitting next to her. I never forgot him. Mr. Thompson continued, his voice tightening a little, as if the memory still hurt, even after all these years. He stayed behind, so the rest of us could make it out alive. But we never saw him again. The next day the camp was overrun, and by the time we came back there was nothing left, just empty ground and the smell of smoke. Claire swallowed hard, trying to process what he was saying. She wasn't sure whether she should speak or just let him finish his story, but something in her gut told her that this was a moment she couldn't ignore, no matter how uncomfortable it felt. She wanted to ask him more questions, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just nodded slowly, as if somehow that would help him continue. That man, Miss Thompson said quietly, he gave his life so we could get away, and I always wondered if it was worth it, if he died knowing he'd saved us, or if he died wondering if anyone would ever remember his name. There was a long pause, and for a moment Claire didn't know what to say. Nothing felt like the right response to something so heavy. She stared at her hands in her lap, unsure whether to speak up or sit quietly and wait for him to say more. Mr. Thompson's eyes flickered back to her now, and this time his gaze wasn't distant, it was focused, intense. I have carried that guilt for years, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. It eats away at you when you know you owe someone your life, and you wonder what kind of person you are for having been the one to survive when they didn't. Claire's heart tightened as she heard the raw emotion in his words, and for the first time in the conversation she could see that he wasn't just telling a story, he was sharing a part of himself, a part that had haunted him for decades. And that realization hit Claire like a wave. She wasn't dealing with a simple old man telling tales. She was dealing with a survivor who had seen and felt things she couldn't even imagine. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself lost in thought, wondering how anyone could live with that kind of guilt, how anyone could carry such a heavy burden for so long. But before she could speak, Miss Thompson continued, as if reading her mind. You learn to live with it, or it consumes you, he said softly. It doesn't matter how many years pass, or how many times you try to bury the memories, they always find a way back. He paused again, and Claire could see the weight of his years pressing down on him. The weariness in his eyes spoke of a life full of battles, both physical and emotional battles, that had shaped him into the man sitting next to her now. For a moment neither of them spoke, the plane's hum filling the silence between them. Claire wanted to ask him more, but she didn't know how to approach it. She felt a deep sense of respect for him, now a respect she hadn't even realized she lacked earlier. She saw him differently, not just as an old man traveling alone, but as someone who had lived through things that would forever alter the course of his life. Finally, Miss Thompson looked at her once more, his expression softening slightly. I never wanted to tell anyone about this, he said almost to himself. But sometimes you need someone to listen, even if they can't understand. Claire nodded slowly, and she realized that in some strange way she was now a part of his story too, whether she liked it or not. Claire sat in silence, unsure of how to respond to Miss Thompson's words. The weight of his story hung in the air. Between them like a heavy fog. She had heard many tales in her time as a flight attendant, but none had ever felt so real, so raw, as the one he just shared. She glanced over at him, his eyes still distant. But there was something different now, something that had shifted between them. As if the walls that had once separated them had started to crumble, she felt a deep sense of respect for him, but also a creeping sense of discomfort as she realized how little she had truly understood about the people around her. Miss Thompson cleared his throat and shifted in his seat, as if pulling himself back from the past and back into the present. He turned to her and smiled that quiet, knowing smile, but this time it was different. It wasn't a smile of politeness or resignation. It was a smile that spoke of something far deeper, something that only someone who had lived through the kind of experiences he had could understand. Claire met his gaze, and for a brief moment they both seemed to acknowledge that they were no longer strangers to one another. The story he had shared had created a bridge between them, one that neither could ignore. "I suppose you think I'm just another old man with a tale to tell," Miss Thompson said softly, his voice steady, but laced with a hint of something almost imperceptible. "But you see, there's more to every story than what's told on the surface. Sometimes what's beneath the surface is what truly matters." He paused, looking down at his notebook, before meeting her eyes again, his gaze intense and searching. "I've lived a long life, Claire, and sometimes I think the only thing that keeps me going is the need to make sure my stories are heard before they're lost to time." His words seemed to linger in the air, as if they carried a deeper meaning, something that Claire couldn't quite grasp yet, but felt in her bones. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, trying to gather her thoughts, but there was something about his presence that made it difficult to focus. Her mind was racing, and she found herself wondering what else he had lived through, what else he had witnessed in his long years of service, what other burdens he carried that he had never spoken of. But before she could ask him another question, he spoke again, his voice even quieter than before. "There was a time when I thought I'd never make it out of those dark places, when I thought I wouldn't survive the things I had seen, the choices I had made." He said, his voice shaking ever so slightly, but his eyes were steady, unwavering, as if he had accepted the reality of what he had endured. "I thought that maybe if I could forget, I could find peace. But the memories never let go. They stay with you, they grow in you, and one day you realize you can't run from them anymore." Claire felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she listened. His words were so personal, so raw. She felt like she was peering into his soul, and she wasn't sure if she should turn away or stay and listen. Miss Thompson continued, his gaze never leaving hers. "And yet here I am still telling my story, after all these years, still trying to make sense of it all. Maybe you'll understand one day, maybe you won't, but the truth is there's no escaping the things we carry with us." He paused again, and Claire found herself holding her breath, as if the very air around them had thickened with the weight of his confession. For a moment they sat in silence, and it felt like time itself had slowed down, as if the world outside the plane no longer mattered. There were only the two of them sharing this fragile moment, one that would soon be over as the flight would come to an end. But something told Claire that she would never forget this conversation, that she would never forget Miss Thompson, and the way his words had left an imprint on her heart. When he spoke again, it was with a quiet sense of finality. "I don't expect anyone to truly understand the things I've lived through, but I do expect them to listen," he said, and his voice was strong despite the frailty of his body. "Sometimes that's all we need, just someone to listen." Claire nodded slowly, feeling the gravity of his request pressing down on her. It wasn't just about listening to a story. It was about acknowledging the life behind it, the suffering, the survival, the moments that had shaped this man into who he was now. She realized that all along she had been quick to judge him for his age, for his appearance, but in doing so she had missed the most important part of him, the part that mattered most. Claire sat there in stunned silence, her mind swirling with everything Miss Thompson had just shared with her. It was as if the entire world around them had faded away, and there was nothing left. But his story, his presence, the truth of his words, seemed to echo through the cabin louder than any sound of the plane's engines, or the whispers of other passengers. His admission had shaken her to her core, and she wasn't sure what to do with it all. What could she say to someone who had lived through so much, and carried it all alone for so long? For a long time neither of them spoke, the weight of the conversation hanging between them like a thick fog. It wasn't awkward exactly, but there was an unspoken understanding that had developed between them in that moment. Claire felt herself becoming more and more aware of the vast distance between their lives, yet she couldn't help but feel drawn to him, as though his experiences had reached out to her in a way she never expected or understood. Finally Miss Thompson broke the silence, his voice softer now, but still carrying that same strength. "I never meant for anyone to carry my burden," he said quietly, his eyes looking away from her and toward the window, as though he were seeing something far off in the distance. "It's something you learn to carry alone. You don't want to burden others with your pain, your past. But sometimes it has a way of creeping in when you least expect it." His voice faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. Claire nodded slowly, though she wasn't entirely sure what she could say to that. She had always been taught to stay professional, to keep a distance from passengers. But this was different. This wasn't a flight she was serving on. This wasn't just another transaction of service. This was a real human connection between two people, sharing something far more intimate than the usual small talk that filled her days in the cabin. "I know what you mean," Claire said before she could stop herself, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't know why she said it, but the words had come out before she could stop them. She could feel the vulnerability creeping in, but something about his story had made her realize that she too carried burdens that she kept hidden, things that no one else would understand, things that she didn't even have the words for. It was strange, but in that moment she felt as though she and Mr. Thompson were more alike than different, despite the years that separated them. Miss Thompson turned to look at her, his eyes softening, as if he had heard the unspoken meaning in her words. "You carry your own weight too, don't you?" he said quietly. And there was no judgment in his voice, just understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that everyone had their own story, their own pain to deal with. Claire wasn't sure how to respond. She hadn't expected him to understand her the way he did, but his insight seemed to cut through the walls she had built around herself, in the same way his story had cut through the layers of her professional demeanor. For a moment Claire felt like she might burst into tears, but she held them back. There was something about Miss Thompson that made her want to be strong for him, to show him that she could be someone who could listen without judgment, someone who understood, even when she couldn't possibly comprehend the full depth of what he had been through. "I've seen a lot of things too," she said after a long pause. "Not the same things you have, but enough to know how it feels to carry something heavy and not know who to talk to about it." Her voice was steady, but the words came out more easily than she expected. She hadn't realized how much she needed to say them until they left her lips. It was like a dam had broken, and now the flood of emotion she had held back for so long was threatening to overwhelm her. Miss Thompson's eyes softened even more as he reached out and placed a hand gently on hers. It wasn't much, but it was enough to convey more than words ever could. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment it felt like the most comforting thing Claire had ever experienced. It made her feel like she wasn't alone in her struggles, that someone else understood, that the weight she carried wasn't hers alone to bear. "I don't expect you to understand everything, Miss Thompson," said, his voice almost a whisper now. "But sometimes it helps just to know that someone is willing to listen, that someone cares enough to sit with you in your silence." Claire nodded again, her heart swelling with a strange mixture of gratitude and sadness. She didn't know how to explain it. But in that quiet moment, she felt closer to Miss Thompson than she had ever felt with anyone else on this plane, and perhaps closer than she had ever felt to anyone in her life. The hum of the plane seemed distant now as Clea sat there in the moment with Miss Thompson, their hands still resting together. The brief but meaningful connection between them felt like a quiet understanding that went beyond words. For the first time in a long time, Clea felt like she wasn't just a flight attendant taking care of passengers. She was part of something more, something real, something human. It was almost surreal how quickly this man had gone from just another elderly passenger to someone she felt she could truly connect with. Miss Thompson slowly pulled his hand back, but his gaze didn't leave her. He studied her with a quiet intensity, as if he was trying to understand her as much as she was trying to understand him. His eyes were still filled with that depth that came from having lived through things that others couldn't possibly comprehend. And yet now they were looking at her with a tenderness that was hard to ignore. Clea shifted uncomfortably in her seat, unsure of what to do with the unexpected emotions swirling inside her. She wasn't used to feeling so vulnerable, so seen. For a long time, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like an old friend that neither could escape. It was a peaceful kind of silence, though not awkward, but full of meaning. Clea found herself reflecting on what Miss Thompson had said, and the weight of his words lingered in her mind. She thought about the burden of guilt he carried for the man who had sacrificed his life, and for the first time she felt the weight of her own burdens more clearly than she ever had before. "What happens when you can't forget?" Claire asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The question had been on her mind for a while now, and it felt strange to ask it aloud, but it had become something she needed to know. She needed to understand how someone like Miss Thompson could continue to live with the things he had seen and the choices he had made. How could he go on day after day when the memories never truly let go? Mr. Thompson looked at her for a long moment before answering. His face grew even more serious as he spoke. "You don't forget, you learn to live with it," he said slowly. "You learn to make peace with the fact that it will always be there, lurking just beneath the surface. But you can't let it control you." He paused for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "The trick is to keep moving forward, to find meaning in the things you can control, the things that give you purpose, even when everything else feels like it's falling apart." Claire swallowed hard as she processed his words. She could feel the heaviness of them pressing on her chest. She wasn't sure if she could ever truly make peace with the things that haunted her, but hearing Miss Thompson speak with such conviction made her wonder if it was possible. Maybe it wasn't about forgetting, maybe it was about learning to accept the past and finding a way to keep moving forward, no matter how difficult that might be. "I think you're right," she said after a long silence, her voice steady now, though there was still a quiet sadness in her words. "It's not about forgetting, it's about finding a way to live with it, but sometimes that's the hardest part." She didn't know if she believed it entirely, but in that moment it felt like the most honest thing she could say. She had spent so many years running from the past, burying her feelings and fears in work and distractions, but now she was beginning to see that the only way out was through it. She had to face what she had been avoiding, and maybe that was the hardest part of all. Miss Thompson nodded slowly as if he understood completely. "It's not easy," he agreed, his voice softening again. "But nothing worth having is ever easy, and sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves." He paused, then added with a faint smile, "But that's where the real strength comes from, when you can face yourself and keep going anyway." Claire felt a wave of emotion rush over her, and for the first time since she had met Miss Thompson, she allowed herself to feel everything she had been holding back, the grief, the regret, the fear she had buried deep inside. She felt like she was being given permission to be vulnerable, to acknowledge the parts of herself she had tried to ignore for so long. It was both freeing and terrifying at the same time. The plane continued to hum softly beneath them as they sat there in the quiet, and Claire realized that this conversation was more than just a passing moment. It was something that would stay with her long after the flight ended. She had never expected her day to turn out like this, never imagined that a simple interaction with an elderly man could change the way she saw the world. But here she was no longer just an observer of life, but a participant in it. And as the flight pressed on toward its destination, Claire knew that she wasn't the same person who had boarded this plane just hours ago. She had learned something valuable from Miss Thompson, something that would stay with her forever, even if she never saw him again. The hours seemed to blur together as the flight stretched on, and Claire found herself lost in her thoughts, no longer paying attention to the usual hum of the plane or the steady rhythm of passengers settling into their seats. She was still wrapped in the conversation she had just had with Miss Thompson, and the weight of it lingered around her like a fog that refused to lift. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt this kind of connection with someone, especially a stranger, someone she had only met hours ago. But there was something about him, something that made her feel as if she had known him for much longer than that. Miss Thompson sat quietly beside her now, his eyes closed, as if he were resting, but Claire knew better. She could sense that he was still thinking, reflecting on the past in his mind, maybe even reliving those moments that had shaped him into who he was today. He hadn't said much since their last exchange, but that was okay. Claire didn't feel the need to fill the silence anymore. She had come to realize that some moments didn't need to be rushed or interrupted, they just needed to be. But then the calm of the moment was shattered by a sudden shift in the plane's movement. Claire's heart skipped a beat as the plane seemed to dip slightly, sending a ripple of unease through the cabin. The quiet murmur of passengers grew louder as the plane steadied itself, and the crew began to move down the aisles to reassure the passengers. Claire's instincts kicked in, and she immediately stood up, her eyes darting toward the front of the plane where the flight attendants were stationed. It was then that she noticed Miss Thompson's expression had changed. His face had gone pale, and his grip on the armrest tightened. The calm demeanor he had shown earlier was replaced by a look of fear. Claire's heart raced as she realized that this man who had so bravely shared his past with her was now visibly shaken by the turbulence. She had seen passengers react to turbulence before, but never quite like this, never with such an almost palpable sense of dread. "Mr. Thompson," Claire said gently, leaning toward him, her voice low, so that the other passengers wouldn't overhear. "Are you okay?" She tried to keep her tone reassuring, but she couldn't hide the concern in her voice. Her hand hovered near his, but she didn't want to crowd him too much, just enough to show that she was there. He blinked rapidly, as if snapping out of a trance, and his eyes locked onto hers for a moment before he gave a small nod. But there was something in his gaze that made Claire's chest tighten. It wasn't fear of flying that she saw in his eyes. It was something else, something deeper, something that seemed to connect with the stories he had told her earlier, with the weight of the guilt and memories that he carried. "I'll be fine," he said in a voice that didn't quite sound like his own. It was shaky and unconvincing. Claire wasn't sure what to say next. She could feel the air around them growing thicker with tension, and her instincts told her that this moment was about to shift again in a way that neither of them could predict. As the turbulence continued, Claire noticed that Miss Thompson's fingers were now gripping the armrest with such force that his knuckles were turning white. She wanted to do something, anything, to help him feel more at ease, but she was torn. She didn't know how to break through whatever barrier had suddenly risen between them. She had seen this kind of fear before in her years of service, but never in someone who had seemed so calm, so composed just moments ago. Without thinking, Claire reached for his hand, the one that had rested so gently on hers before, and when her fingers touched his, there was a slight tremor in his grip. But he didn't pull away. Instead, he held onto her hand like a lifeline, as if in that moment she was the only thing tethering him to the present, to reality, and not the memories that seemed to consume him. For a few moments they sat like that in silence, with only the sound of the plane's engines and the occasional murmur from the passengers around them, it was as though the world outside had faded, and there was nothing left but the two of them in this shared space, this shared moment. Claire could feel his pulse beneath her fingertips, and in that small touch she realized how fragile everything was, how easily the things we take for granted could slip away. And then, without warning, Miss Thompson spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with such intensity that it sent a shiver down Claire's spine. "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time she could see the raw vulnerability in his eyes, the layers of guilt and regret that had been buried so deeply now coming to the surface. "I never told you the full truth." His words hung in the air, like a confession, one that he had been holding on to for far too long. Claire's heart pounded as she looked at him, unsure of what was coming next, unsure of how deep this story was about to go. She squeezed his hand gently, as if to let him know that she was ready to listen, ready to hear whatever he was about to say. "I didn't just survive," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I ran away." Claire's heart raced as Miss Thompson's words hung in the air like a thick fog. She squeezed his hand tighter, trying to steady the shaking that had suddenly overtaken her body. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but it wasn't this she had expected. Maybe more stories of hardship, more reflections on the war or life on the road, but not this confession that felt like it had been buried for decades, buried deep enough that it had become a part of him that no one could see, no one could understand until now. Miss Thompson turned his head slightly away from her, his eyes closing briefly, as if the weight of his own words had struck him harder than he had anticipated. It was as though he had been preparing for this moment for years, and now that it was here, he wasn't sure if he was ready to face it after all these years of keeping it locked inside. "I wasn't just a soldier," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the plane. "I was a deserter. I ran when the battle got too tough, when the fear became too much to bear." He paused, as if the confession itself was causing a physical pain. "I wasn't brave. I wasn't a hero. I left my comrades behind when they needed me the most, and I've never forgiven myself for that." His voice cracked on the last words, and Claire could feel the guilt pouring out of him like an open wound. She didn't know what to say. The confession was so raw, so painful. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest. It wasn't just a story of survival. It was a story of failure, of regret, of a man who had never allowed himself to heal or forgive himself for something he couldn't change. She wanted to tell him that it wasn't his fault, that fear made people do things they wouldn't otherwise do, but she knew those words would feel hollow coming from someone who hadn't lived through what he had. Instead, she simply nodded, her grip on his hand tightening ever so slightly, as if to say, "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." She didn't need to speak. She just needed to show him that he wasn't alone. Miss Thompson let out a long, shaky breath and opened his eyes slowly, meeting her gaze once more. "I thought running away would make it all go away." He continued, his voice steadying now, but still filled with the weight of his confession. "I thought if I could just escape the memories, if I could just bury them deep enough, no one would ever know the truth. But the truth is always there, Claire, always waiting for you to face it, even if it takes a lifetime." He gave her a small, sad smile. "And now I spent most of my life trying to outrun it, trying to outrun who I am." Claire felt a wave of sympathy wash over her, but she couldn't help but feel that something in Miss Thompson had shifted in that moment, as if this confession had freed him in some small way, maybe not completely, but enough to open the door to healing just a crack. She had seen it before in people. They carried their burdens for so long, and sometimes it took someone else to finally make them see that they didn't have to carry them alone anymore. "I think we all have things we're running from," she said quietly, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "Things we've done or things we've said that we wish we could take back, things we think we can never forgive ourselves for." She paused as the words began to spill out before she could stop them. "I know I've been running for a long time too." Miss Thompson turned to her, and for the first time since their conversation, had started his expression, softened his gaze, searching hers, as if he saw something in her that he hadn't before, as if he had finally understood her, just as much as she had understood him. "Maybe that's what we're meant to do," he said softly, his voice now full of understanding. "Maybe we're meant to run until we're ready to stop, until we're ready to face what we've been hiding from all along." There was a long pause between them, both of them sitting in silence, as the plane soared through the sky. But it was a different kind of silence. Now it wasn't heavy with tension or guilt. It was a quiet understanding, a mutual recognition of the burdens they had carried for so long, and the knowledge that somehow, in this shared moment, they had both taken the first step toward letting go. Claire felt a strange sense of calm wash over her as she stared at Miss Thompson. In that moment she realized that they had both been searching for the same thing, not answers, not redemption, but simply understanding. She had come to the conclusion that there was no perfect resolution to what they had been through, no neat little package to make everything right, but perhaps that was okay. Maybe the journey was enough, maybe just facing the truth and being seen for who they really were was the answer they had been searching for all along. As the plane began its descent, Claire looked out the window and then back at Miss Thompson, who was sitting peacefully beside her now, his eyes closed as though he had finally found a moment of peace. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew that this encounter had changed them both forever, and somehow, in that quiet moment, they had both begun the journey of healing.